Everyone's talking about ultra-processed food. Over the past year, Google searches for the term have shot up as more and more people want to know how they're impacting our health and how best they can be avoided. But are people making the right changes? Why are they so dangerous? And should we be cutting them out of our diets entirely? I'm Sally Bidulph, and this is what you need to know. Hello and welcome to today's episode of What You Need to Know. I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by gut health doctor, Dr. Megan Rossi. Thanks very much for coming in to speak to us. Welcome to the podcast. I think the best place to start is, what is an ultra-processed food?
Great question. So essentially, it's a category of food that most of us are eating too much of. And generally speaking, you can think of foods that contains ingredients that you're unlikely to have at home, or if you were to make that exact food at home, you wouldn't include half of the, ingredients that you'd find in these packaged ultra-processed versions. And I think a good example is wraps. A lot of people think wraps are really healthy, right? Now, if you make wraps at home, you need flour and water, maybe a little bit of salt for some extra flavour, right? Pretty simple. But if you go to the supermarkets and look at these mass-produced wraps, most of them have at least 10 ingredients. So yes, they'll contain the flour, a little bit of salt, but also they'll contain various additives like emulsifiers, extra fats like palm oil, different added sugars as well for that sweetness. We kind of want more and more of it. And also they contain these kind of pre-digested types of flour. So not just the flour, but actually they'll contain things like flour gluten, so the protein component, kind of broken down already. So actually, when you look at it like that, it contains a whole lot of extra ingredients you're unlikely to have at home, and that essentially is what we classify as ultra-processed foods.
And these ingredients that we wouldn't necessarily have in our store cupboards at home, I don't think any of us have like partially processed gluten at home. What are they doing to us? Because you're moving away from whole foods to very modified foods. So what are they actually doing to our bodies?
Yeah, a very good question, right? And I think there's been a lot of fear mongering around ultra-processed foods where people have been told that perhaps they're toxic and people are like, oh my God, they're poisonous. But it's very much not the case. I think if we think of these ultra-processed foods, there are 4 reasons why they've been associated with, increased risk of type 2 diabetes, several cancers, heart disease, etc. So the first one actually is the fact that they're so palatable, they're so delicious. So they typically add the right combination of fat and added sugars and extra additives that make them so fluffy and it's hard to stop at maybe just 1 or 2 slices, and you want more and more, right? So we're actually having a whole lot more of them than we would if we were having this equivalent food from, homemade. So that's the first issue. The second issue is around this fact called the thermogenic effect of food. Right? So that essentially just means when we eat food, we take in energy, but we actually burn energy through the digestive process of eating that food. Now, what we've seen through the research studies is that a lot of these ultra-processed foods, the thermogenic effect, we actually burn around 50% less calories digesting them, because a lot of that digestion kind of has been done for us. For example, like I said about the wraps, they contain, instead of just the whole flour, it contains like the pre-digested flour gluten and flour starch.
So does that mean we're taking more calories as well?
Exactly. Yeah. So actually, we don't have to work hard to extract the calories, and therefore the net gain of calories is much higher. Now, the third one, which is something actually my team at King's College in London is investigating, this is around food additives. Now, I don't want to be fear-mongering here because I think it's really important to know that there is, hundreds of food additives that have been approved as safe to be in our food supply, right? They have to go through quite a rigorous process.
Sure.
The thing about that is a lot of that safety testing was done before we discovered that we have these trillions of bacteria in our gut and how important these bacteria are for things like chronic conditions like, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, mental health, all of that sort of stuff. So actually what we're doing is reassessing the safety profile. And like I mentioned, some of the clinical trials we're going at King's is looking at categories called food additive emulsifiers. Research isn't out yet, but the pilot data does suggest that perhaps some of these types may, for people who particularly are more genetically predisposed to gut inflammation, may slightly increase their risk there. But again, don't want to be fear-mongering. It's not if you have a little bit, it's going to be disastrous. It's if you're having too much of these, right?
And these emulsifiers, what do they kind of change the bacteria makeup in your gut, or do they make some grow more, some grow less? How does that work?
Yeah, so the mechanisms is several-fold, but absolutely one of them is the fact we think it changes the types of microbes. So instead of them being anti-inflammatory, where these microbes, most of them actually really want to look after us, right? They want us to be healthy because they'll thrive as well. But actually it changes some of them to be more pro-inflammatory, more aggressive and angry. And also, like why emulsifiers are added to foods, what they do is mix oil and water together. So that's why, you know, mayonnaise and things like that, we add emulsifiers to kind of have that effect. And this is what we think is happening in our gut lining. So we've got the gut lining, we've got this thick mucus layer, right? So these emulsifiers that we eat, we think actually might thin down the mucus layer, which means things that normally can't get into our blood system from our gut actually start to pass through.
So aside from the biome, which you've talked about in terms of how it can disrupt the biome inside your body, the really healthy bacteria that are helping you digest, you talk about the calorie intake as well. So does this mean that we are just consuming more calories, and that means that we could put on more weight, hold more fat, more predisposed to things like heart attacks, stroke, diabetes?
Absolutely. So kind of taking in more calories than our body actually needs. And the other element is when we think about whole foods, they're full of these things called phytochemicals, which have all these amazing anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects, which, you know, essentially protects our cells from, you know, cancer damage and all of that sort of stuff. So take an apple, for example. It actually contains close to 300 different phytochemicals, including a lot of these really important anti-inflammatory chemicals. Now, if you take that apple and then start to refine it and make it ultra-processed and just extract the juice to like apple juice concentrate, actually you're losing a lot of those antioxidant powers, as well as the fact that a normal apple, you know, that we pick up actually contains 100 million bacteria. So again, the more processing, you're actually stamping out a lot of the protective qualities. So having that apple juice isn't going to directly cause you any, you know, instant harm, but the fact that you're not eating all of those antioxidants that you would get from a whole apple that we need because there's pollution and all this other damage that we're getting is another mechanism to why these ultra-processed foods, if we're having too much of them, are associated with so many health risks.
But if we think about a general shop, your weekly shop when you go to the supermarket or you get a food delivery, what could we be looking for to minimise ultra-processed foods? Because we all buy things that have been through a processing mechanism, whether it's bread or cereal or staples that we are used to. What can we do to recognise them and then to minimise them? Yeah,
that's a really good question. And I think, in all honesty, we have to start looking at the backs of packs. Because, you know, again, I spoke about pittas or wraps. Not all wraps, sadly the vast majority, I would say about 90% on the supermarket shelves, are ultra-processed. But there are a few brands out there that aren't. So the only way we can really tell, unfortunately at the moment, is turning it over, looking at the ingredients panel. Now when you go through the ingredients panel, if you see a whole lot of different ingredients, you're like, whoa, firstly, I wouldn't have access to them at home, or if I was making it, I wouldn't be adding all these extra bits that are unnecessary. Then you'd probably think, look, that's ultra-processed. Now, if there's just a couple of ingredients that you're like, oh yeah, I'd probably include that, oh, there's this additive, I'm not sure, you know, but it's only one or two, then what I would say is don't freak out. It's probably going to be okay, because there are, like I said, many additives that have been approved as safe. Some of them sound scary, like ascorbic acid is literally vitamin C.
So actually quite good for you.
Yeah, exactly. So don't be too scared, but you typically can recognise them because there'll be a very long list, and quite a few of them will be additives and things you wouldn't have access to.
And would they normally kind of be bunched together under things like emulsifiers and fortifiers and modified starches and modified fats and things like that?
100%.
Yeah. So say I'm buying a box of cereal for my children. Yeah. Breakfast staple for all of us. If I'm looking at it and it's fortified as well, is that an ultra-processed food? So you've got like niacin and thiamine and all of these different vitamins and minerals.
Yeah. You've raised a really good point, right? So yes, according to this classification, it's called the NOVA system of how we classify food into 4 different categories. Firstly, we've got the unprocessed or minimally processed, and that's things like oats on their own, you know, fruit and veg. Then you've got the processed kitchen ingredients or culinary ingredients. So that's things like your sugar, your fat, your oils and things like that. Not all of them are healthy, some of them can be healthy. Then the third category is your processed foods, and that's things like, you know, healthy yogurt, you know, homemade bread where it has to go through a processing.
Yeah, and then the fourth, done a process to make it.
Exactly, yeah. So not all processed food is bad. And that fourth category is those ultra processed foods. Now for that definition, if you actually look at it, it does say if it's fortified with extra vitamins, which for me is a bit frustrating as a dietitian nutritionist, because you're like, well, actually that doesn't mean it's unhealthy. And that's some of the work we're also doing at King's, where we're looking at ultra-processed foods, but we're also looking at the health factor of them, because not all ultra-processed foods are unhealthy. Yes, a lot of them are, but actually some of them can be really nutritious. Like, for example, baby infant formula, which, you know, is so important for a lot of babies' upbringings. That is classified as ultra-processed. So I think we need to be really careful about how we demonize foods just because it fits that kind of that definition. And I think the research world, we're trying to maybe come up with a new category and a new definition, so people kind of have that idea of ultra-processed foods, you know, they really are the unhealthy ones, and the ones that are, you know, still processed but quite healthy are separate from that definition.
So it's really kind of drilling down and understanding how processed the food is, whether you recognise any of the ingredients, and then understanding if the things that are added could potentially be good for you, like a vitamin A or an ascorbic acid, things that you've outlined.
Exactly, but I don't want people to think, oh my God, I have to become a nutritionist to understand all this. So, you know, it's just looking generally, and as well as, you know, what percentage of your diet comes from a packet. If a large percent, then you might be thinking, look, okay, I don't love cooking, but you know what, once a month I'm going to do some bulk baking, I'm going to freeze it. Like, my freezer is full of like prepped meals, right?
Yeah, mine too. You make a very big batch and then you just freeze little portions.
Exactly. And I think that's the way we need to start thinking, instead of being like, you know, fixating on each ingredient list, because to be honest, a lot of the stuff in the supermarket will be ultra-processed. We can't get away from that.
I mean, life is very busy, whether you've got children, whether you're not, whether you're working full-time, whether you're not. How would you tell us to approach a meal for time-poor people?
Yeah, so I'm totally on board with that. What I typically do is like your mixed pack of veg is already cut up for you, right? You know, some sort of protein might be your mixed beans. Again, you can get them for like 60p, a can of mixed beans. You know, a bit of soy sauce, maybe some sriracha, something like that. So you have a stir fry within like 15 minutes. And then instead of always, I think we typically just go, you know, your rice or your pasta, try and get different grains. You can get like quinoa and stuff, which can take like, you know, 10 minutes to cook. So I think very basic, kind of prepped, but without any dressing on it, so you can add your own dressing at home, typically is a kind of a easy way to avoid ultra-processed foods.
But fully recognise what your ingredients are. Exactly. And whole foods.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much for that taster into ultra-processed food. And thank you for listening. For more on this, head over to our website. And do have a look back through all our other quick briefings on a range of headline topics to find out what you need to know. Until next time, thank you for listening.